Have you ever heard about a medical procedure and just thought, how could that have ever been considered a good idea?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, today we're diving into one of those,
Okay.
a lobotomy.
It's a fascinating and disturbing part of medical history
Yeah.
where this desperation for solutions
Mhm.
and a limited understanding of the brain led to some really devastating consequences.
Absolutely. And we're going to explore an article about the dark history of lobotomy.
Okay.
And not just the what of the procedure, but the how and the why it became so widespread.
It's really a story that makes you question how something so seemingly barbaric could not only become common practice, but even be lauded as a breakthrough.
Yeah, really unbelievable.
Yeah.
To understand it, though, I think we really have to step back to the early 20th century.
Okay.
In the United Kingdom.
Right.
Mental illness was heavily stigmatized, and treatment options were extremely limited.
Yes, you had things like insulin shock therapy to induce comas or electroconvulsive therapy,
Right.
better known as ECT. These were desperate measures for desperate times.
And within this context,
Yeah.
lobotomy emerged, and it wasn't just quietly accepted,
Right.
it was actually embraced.
It was initially hailed as a miracle cure by doctors and the media,
Wow.
touted as a solution for a staggering range of conditions,
Right.
from
Schizophrenia?
severe depression to things like aggression and even learning disabilities.
So they were basically saying that it could fix anything.
It seems almost unbelievable looking back.
Yeah.
But yes, the prevailing thought was that lobotomy could address this vast array of issues.
Wow.
In the UK alone, over 20,000 lobotomies were performed.
That many.
And here's a chilling detail.
Okay.
One prominent British neurosurgeon, Sir Wally McKissick, boasted that a skilled team could perform 4 lobotomies in just 2 hours.
4 lobotomies in 2 hours. That's more like an assembly line than a medical procedure.
Yeah.
I mean, doesn't that raise serious questions about the level of care and consideration given to each patient?
Absolutely, and it reflects the mindset at the time.
Right. Yeah.
It's also a stark contrast to today's standards, where neurosurgery is considered a highly specialized and intricate field with significant risks involved.
So how did this practice gain such a foothold in the UK?
Well, it's important to remember that mental illness carried an immense social stigma.
Right.
Families were often desperate for anything that promised relief or a return to normalcy for their loved ones.
So that's a crucial point. The societal pressure to conform to appear normal
Yeah.
undoubtedly played a role in lobotomy's popularity.
Right.
It's a reminder of how social context can significantly influence medical practices.
Precisely. Now, let's shift our focus across the Atlantic
Okay.
to the United States,
Right.
where the story of lobotomy takes an even more unsettling turn
Okay.
with a figure named Walter Freeman.
Ah, yes, Walter Freeman.
Yeah.
He's almost synonymous with lobotomy in the U.S.
And for good reason.
All right.
Freeman was a neurologist who became obsessed with lobotomy and aggressively promoted it across the country,
Really?
traveling from hospital to hospital
Wow.
in a van he called the Lobotomobile.
The lobotomobile. That image is both bizarre and chilling.
Yeah,
It's almost like something out of a dystopian novel.
it really is.
Wow.
Freeman believed so strongly in lobotomy's potential that he essentially turned it into a road show, performing thousands of procedures,
Wow.
often with little regard for long-term consequences.
So to understand how this happened,
Yeah.
we need to go back to the origins of the procedure.
Right.
Who actually came up with this idea
Yeah.
of cutting into the brain to cure mental illness?
So the pioneer of lobotomy was a Portuguese neurologist named Egas Moniz.
Okay.
He developed the prefrontal leucotomy in the 1930s,
Okay.
based on the flawed theory that severing connections of the prefrontal cortex could disrupt obsessive thoughts and alleviate mental illness.
So he believed that by cutting those connections, he could essentially rewire the brain.
Yeah.
It seems incredibly simplistic, almost like treating the brain like a faulty circuit board.
And that's where the danger lies.
Right.
The brain is infinitely more complex than a circuit board.
Mm-hmm.
Moniz's theory drastically oversimplified the functions of the prefrontal cortex,
Right.
which is responsible for a wide range of higher-order cognitive processes,
Yeah.
like planning, decision-making, and emotional regulation.
So severing those connections didn't just stop obsessive thoughts.
Right.
It likely had a profound impact on a person's entire personality and ability to function.
Exactly. And to further illustrate how flawed Moniz's understanding was, consider this.
Okay.
He was actually awarded the Nobel Prize in 1949 for his work on lobotomy.
Wait, he won a Nobel Prize for this?
Yeah,
That's almost unbelievable considering the damage that lobotomy
it's a
caused.
shocking fact.
Yeah.
That underscores how even the most prestigious scientific accolades can be clouded by the limitations of knowledge and understanding at a particular point in time.
Right.
It also raises important questions about the ethics of medical awards and the long-term consequences of scientific breakthroughs.
It's a stark reminder that progress doesn't always equate to ethical or beneficial outcomes.
Right.
It really makes you think about how medical practices that uh, that seem completely unthinkable now were once widely accepted.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that our understanding of the brain and mental illness is constantly evolving. What was considered cutting-edge science decades ago
Right.
is now viewed as a barbaric practice.
Speaking of barbaric, let's talk about what the actual lobotomy procedure involved.
Okay.
Sounds pretty gruesome.
Brace yourself, because it is pretty gruesome.
Okay.
The early lobotomies developed by Moniz involved drilling holes in the skull to access the prefrontal cortex.
Oh, wow.
And then they would insert sharp instruments to sever the nerve fibers.
So they were literally cutting into the brain.
Yes, and it gets worse.
Oh, no.
Walter Freeman,
Right.
in his quest to make lobotomy more accessible and efficient,
Okay.
developed a method called the transorbital lobotomy.
Transorbital, what does that even mean?
It means going through the eye socket.
Oh my gosh.
Freeman would use an instrument resembling an ice pick,
Really?
insert it above the eyeball, and hammer it through the thin bone to reach the brain.
I can't even imagine the pain.
The patient was usually rendered unconscious,
Right.
using electroshock therapy, but there was no anesthesia used during the actual lobotomy.
It's just horrifying to think about.
Mm,
And Freeman performed thousands of these.
Over 3,500 by some estimates.
Wow.
And his patients weren't just adults with severe mental illness.
Right.
He also performed lobotomies on children,
Really?
some as young as 4 years old.
Children.
Yeah.
That's just beyond comprehension.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe that a procedure with such potential for harm could be used so widely and on such vulnerable individuals.
It speaks to the lack of understanding of the brain and the long-term consequences of such a drastic intervention.
Right.
The prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until well into adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
To disrupt its development so drastically could have devastating and irreversible effects.
And what were those effects? What happened to these patients after they underwent lobotomies?
While some individuals showed temporary improvement in their symptoms, many experienced severe and debilitating side effects.
Like what?
Many were left with permanent cognitive impairments.
Oh, gosh.
Some lost their ability to speak clearly, walk, or even feed themselves.
Oh, wow.
Others experienced emotional blunting, a
Right.
kind of flattening of their personality.
So they were essentially trading one set of problems for another, often far worse set of problems.
Unfortunately, that was often the case.
Wow.
And there's one particularly tragic story that highlights the devastating impact of lobotomy.
Okay.
Have you heard of Rosemary Kennedy?
Yes. The sister of President John F. Kennedy.
Right.
I know she was lobotomized.
Rosemary had some intellectual disabilities and behavioral challenges.
Okay.
Her father, Joe Kennedy,
Mm-hmm.
concerned about how her condition would affect the family's image,
Right.
consented to a lobotomy when she was just 23 years old.
And what happened to her?
The procedure left her with severe and permanent impairments.
Oh, wow.
She lost much of her ability to speak and walk and required lifelong care.
It's a heartbreaking story and a stark reminder of the human cost of this procedure.
It's a powerful example of how a procedure intended to help could actually inflict irreparable harm.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that Rosemary's story is just one of thousands.
Right.
Countless individuals and families suffered the devastating consequences of lobotomy.
So, with all these horrific outcomes, how did lobotomy finally fall out of favor?
The development of antipsychotic medications in the 1950s played a major role.
Okay.
Drugs like Thorazine
Right.
offered a less invasive and more effective way to manage the symptoms of mental illness.
So the advent of better pharmaceuticals exposed the brutality and ineffectiveness of lobotomy.
Exactly.
Okay.
And as more research emerged revealing the extent of the damage caused by lobotomies, the medical community began to turn away from the procedure.
Were there any attempts to hold those who championed lobotomy accountable for the harm they caused?
There were campaigns to revoke Egas Moniz's Nobel Prize,
Oh, wow.
but they were ultimately unsuccessful.
Really?
However, the fact that such campaigns existed speaks to the shifting tide of medical opinion and the growing recognition of the ethical and medical failures associated with lobotomy.
By the 1980s, lobotomies were virtually banned in most countries, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Lobotomies, as they were practiced in the mid-20th century, are essentially a relic of the past.
Okay.
However, there are some very limited instances where psychosurgical procedures are still used today,
Oh, really?
but with vastly different techniques and for very specific conditions.
So the legacy of lobotomy lives on in a way, but it's more of a cautionary tale than a continuing practice.
Precisely.
Okay.
It serves as a constant reminder of how crucial it is to approach interventions in the brain with extreme caution,
Mm-hmm.
a thorough understanding of the potential risks and consequences, and a deep respect for the complexity of this incredible organ.
We've talked about the horrific physical and emotional toll lobotomy took on patients.
Right.
But what about the social impact? Did this procedure further stigmatize mental illness?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think it's safe to say that lobotomy in many ways deepened the stigma surrounding mental illness.
Yeah.
It reinforced the idea that mental illness was something to be feared, something that needed to be eradicated or controlled through drastic measures.
It's like they were trying to erase the person rather than treat the illness.
In a sense, yes.
Yeah.
And this had a chilling effect on open discussions about mental health.
Right.
People were even more reluctant to seek help for fear of being subjected to such a radical and potentially life-altering procedure.
It's a tragic irony. A procedure meant to help actually made things worse for countless individuals and families.
And it highlights the importance of addressing the social stigma surrounding mental illness.
Right.
When we view mental health through a lens of fear and misunderstanding,
Yeah.
it opens the door for harmful practices and policies.
It's a reminder that true progress in mental health care requires not only scientific advancements, but also a fundamental shift in how we view and talk about mental illness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We need to move away from the idea of mental illness as something to be feared or hidden, and towards a more compassionate and understanding approach
You're right.
that prioritizes individual well-being and recovery.
You know, it's incredible to think how much our understanding of the brain and mental illness has evolved since the days of lobotomy.
Right.
Yet it's also a bit unsettling to realize that lobotomy wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
I mean, this wasn't ancient history. This happened within the lifetimes of many people alive today.
It's a sobering reminder that medical practices we consider unthinkable now
Right.
were once not only accepted but actively promoted.
It forces us to question what practices we consider acceptable today might be viewed as barbaric in the future.
Right. Those are
Yeah.
important questions to consider, and they're exactly the kind of questions that the history of lobotomy should prompt us to ask. It highlights the importance of continuous scrutiny,
Yeah.
ethical awareness, and a willingness to challenge the status quo, even in the face of seemingly established medical practices.
So lobotomy is essentially a relic of the past. But you mentioned earlier that there are some very limited instances where psychosurgical procedures are still used today.
Yes.
Can you tell us more about that?
It's important to distinguish between the crude and widespread use of lobotomy in the past and the highly specialized and carefully considered use of psychosurgery today.
Okay.
Modern psychosurgery involves very precise techniques, like deep brain stimulation,
Right.
that target very specific areas of the brain. It's generally only considered as a last resort for extremely debilitating conditions like severe OCD or intractable epilepsy that haven't responded to any other treatments.
So it's not about simply severing connections in the brain anymore. It's about using highly targeted interventions to modulate brain activity in a much more controlled way.
Exactly. And the ethical considerations surrounding these procedures are incredibly complex.
Yeah.
There are rigorous protocols in place to ensure informed consent and to carefully weigh the potential benefits against the risks.
Right.
It's a far cry from the days when lobotomies were performed with little regard for long-term consequences.
So while the shadow of lobotomy's dark past still looms over the field of neurosurgery, it also serves as a powerful lesson, urging caution,
Right.
ethical awareness, and a deep respect for the complexities of the brain.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that even with the best intentions, medical interventions can go terribly wrong. We must never forget the lessons of lobotomy as we continue to explore the frontiers of neuroscience and develop new treatments for brain disorders.
Let's recap what we've learned about lobotomy in this deep dive.
Okay.
We started by exploring the historical context,
Right.
a time when mental illness was deeply stigmatized and treatment options were extremely limited.
Yeah.
This created a perfect storm for a procedure like lobotomy to emerge as a supposed miracle cure.
We delved into the flawed science behind the procedure,
Right.
the oversimplification of the brain's functions,
Yeah.
and the hubris of those who championed it, like Walter Freeman with his chilling lobotomobile tours.
We confronted the horrific reality of the procedure itself, from drilling holes in the skull to the even more brutal transorbital method.
Right.
And we heard the tragic stories of those who suffered the devastating consequences, like Rosemary Kennedy, whose life was forever altered by this procedure.
The development of antipsychotic medications marked a turning point,
Mm.
providing a safer and more effective alternative to lobotomy,
Yeah.
leading to its decline and eventual ban in most parts of the world.
And while psychosurgery still exists in a very limited and controlled form today, the legacy of lobotomy serves as a powerful cautionary tale, reminding us of the importance of rigorous scientific scrutiny,
Right.
robust ethical guidelines, and above all, a deep respect for the sanctity of the human brain.
This deep dive into the dark history of lobotomy leaves us with a lot to ponder. What stands out to you most from this exploration?
For me, it's the reminder that medical progress doesn't always equal ethical progress.
Right.
It's crucial to constantly question, to demand transparency, and to hold the medical community accountable for ensuring that new treatments and procedures prioritize patient well-being and autonomy above all else.
Yeah.
What about you? What resonates most with you?
I think what strikes me most is the enduring power of the brain.
Yeah.
Despite the brutal attempts to alter its function through lobotomy, the human spirit persists.
Mm-hmm.
The testament to our resilience, our capacity for adaptation, and the inherent mystery and complexity of the brain that continues to fascinate and challenge us.
It's a powerful reminder that while we've made incredible strides in understanding the brain, we still have so much more to learn.
Right.
And as we continue to explore its mysteries, we must do so with humility, caution, and an unwavering commitment to ethical practices. We can't afford to repeat the mistakes of the past.
Indeed, the history of lobotomy is a stark reminder of what can happen when ambition and hubris overshadow ethical considerations and respect for the complexity of the human brain.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lesson we must never forget.